So this is an extended version of a talk that I gave last month, but since from the introductions, nobody's working in biodiversity informatics except for Ben. I'm going to introduce a bit the landscape that we're working in and where Camtrap DP fits and how it uses frictionless standards. So I'm Peter Desmet. I work for the Open Science Lab for Biodiversity. We're based at the Research Institute for Nature and Forest in Imbo. And our team, we are 6 people, and we support researchers with open data publication, so making sure that research data is publicly available. And also we are developing software, mainly research software such as R packages. Biodiversity information is basically information about the occurrence of species. So what species were found when and where. And sources for that information are very broad. Citizen scientists now make up the largest source of this type of information. And iNaturalist is an international platform where anyone can create an account to record what they see in the wild. But traditionally, there's also been museum collections, monitoring programs, and more sensors that are collecting information on the species around us. Most of this information there is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is, or GBIF for short, which is a platform where people and organizations can publish biodiversity information. So the information that they collected can be published to this central platform. And this has been ongoing for the last 20 years. And a lot of the things in publishing open data are aspects that we've encountered as well, and that have been solved along the way to make this platform possible. So it is an international platform. It is currently hosts close to 2 billion records of species observations. You can see the lower map there. And the very important aspect here is that the data is published in a common data format. So whatever the source of the data, it is using this common data format to submit data to GBIF. And that allows cross dataset search and API, like across all these datasets, no matter what the source, you can search for a species across all this dataset and find occurrences. All data is Creative Commons license, either CC0, CC BY, or CC BY non-commercial. And there is an advanced system for citation tracking. So every download you make on this platform gets a digital object identifier, or a DOI, which you can then reference in your papers so that the publishers of the data are acknowledged and can actually see where their data is used. This common data format is called Darwin Core. It is maintained by the organization Biodiversity Information Standards, which had a conference, an annual conference that happened last month, where I presented Camtrap DP. The Darwin Core is basically a common set of terms to facilitate the exchange of biodiversity information. So it's not much more than a term and a definition. For example, scientific name, we mean that by the term scientific name, or event date, that is the definition of event date. And there's also Darwin Core Archive, which is a kind of a package format for biodiversity information, which has been in use for over 11 years now. And it looks a bit similar to Frictionless Data package. So you have a number of CSV files that are related. And then you have 2 XML files rather than a JSON file that are describing the metadata and the structure. This is packaged up and published on the platforms of the different organizations that are publishing to GBIF. GBIF is then harvesting that data to make it available on the gbif.org website. So that is a bit of a precursor of biodiversity informatics, where publishing biodiversity information has been ongoing for a long time in a standard that is well established called Darwin Core. Camtrap DP then. So camera trapping is a wildlife monitoring technique that is non-invasive. You can set up a camera and mostly animals will not notice it. It's also well established. It's generating more and more data every year. And it enables the study of animal abundance, distribution, and behavior. But it is data intensive, so it generates lots of images or videos. And to support management of this data, there are a number of data management platforms where you can upload and manage the images that your cameras have taken and annotate them with the species identification. This is traditionally done by humans who go through the images to say and identify the species that were recorded, but more and more AI is used to help humans in annotating all these images. There are a number of platforms out there, European ones as well as ones based in the US, but there is limited data exchange between those platforms and also limited data purification from this platform. So they act a little bit as silos. They serve their community pretty well, but not a lot of data is getting out of these platforms, and almost none of this data makes it to, for example, GBIF, where anyone could be able to use that data in combination with other data. So we could use Darwin Core archives as an exchange format for this type of information, but Darwin Core is really a common ground for all type of biodiversity information, so not specific for camera trap data. And that has as the disadvantage that, yeah, you cannot capture the full scope of camera trap data. For example, the project setup, your camera setup are typically things you cannot express in the Darwin Core archive. And also, the cameras will very often capture blank, vehicle, or unknown sequences of images, which can also not be expressed in Darwin Core. The relationships that are allowed in Darwin Core archives are also too limited to really express camera trap data. And the biggest problem is that Darwin Core is a format that will not be recognized by camera trap researchers. So they will not use this format as a preferred format for analyzing data. And that is why we started developing Camtrap DP, and that stands for Camera Trap Data Package. So the name data package from Frictionless Data Packages is incorporated in the name, and is designed to capture all essential data and metadata of a single camera trap study. Of course, data management platforms can capture more information, but Camtrap DP is really capturing the essential information that is required for analysis or to archive your data at the end of a study, for example. It is a model to exchange camera trap data and also a format to exchange camera trapping data. The model, you have metadata about the project or study, and then there are deployments. This is, you've set up your camera at a certain point for a certain, from a start date until an end date at a certain location. And deployments also have camera information, for example, how the camera was oriented. And then throughout this setup, the camera can capture media files. This can either be done on a regular time interval or using a motion sensor if an animal passes. These media files can also be organized in sequences, which is a burst of images that are related. And then the observations are basically the species identifications based on those images, which can be done for every image, which is very labor intensive, except for AI, or what is typically more done when annotated by humans is at the sequence level. I have, for example, seen one moorhen and one coot in this sequence of images. There are also, as I mentioned, blank sequences as well. So a trigger where, for example, grass was waving, but no animal was captured. The way we format that data is something that you will recognize is as a frictionless data package. So the metadata is stored in the data package JSON file, where we also store the project metadata. And then we have 3 CSV files, the deployments, the media that were captured in those deployments, and then the observations based on those media files, with a number of identifiers between those 3 files. A number of foreign keys between those files. So we are using Frictionless Standards for this, which is something rather new for biodiversity information. And the ones that we are using is data package, obviously, for datasets, the data resource, which describes the data files, and then table schema to define the fields in those CSV files. And what we really like is that it's a simple way of describing data. It's machine usable and also extendable, which is exactly what we're doing with Camtrap DP. So we have developed our own custom data package profile. which references and extends data package. The link that you see in orange might be very small, is basically referencing data package. So a Camtrap data package must be a data package. So all the requirements that are there in data package are also there in Camtrap data package. But we do two additional things. One is we have additional requirements or strict requirements for some of the properties. For example, we think that contributors and created, which are optional in data package, must be there, are required for a Camtrap data package. And we also require these three specific resources: the deployments, the media, and the observation CSVs. And we also add a number of new properties. For example, the organization that captured the data, the project information with some sampling setup and some metadata or project study level metadata to really describe how this data was captured. And then also the spatial, temporal, and taxonomic scope of this data set. From when till when was this project set up, at what place, and what are the species that were captured with this study. And then we have three table schemas, one for each of the three resources, which describe the relationship between the resources. And as a typical table schema, also for every field has the name, a definition, the type and format that we expect for that field, whether it's required, the controlled vocabularies, which are expressed as an enum in the constraints. And we also link out to related definitions. For example, many of the definitions that we have are reusing Darwin core definitions. And to indicate the link between a field that we have and Darwin core, we use a property SCOS exact match to link out, or SCOS narrow match to link out to the Darwin core definition, saying this field here is basically the same as that field or that term in Darwin core. So how should data sets reference Camtrap DP? That is something we've been struggling with a little bit. For the profile, it's fairly easy. There's a profile property, and we can link to our Camtrap DP profile, which can be a URL including a version. So you can publish a data set saying, I'm using Camtrap DP 0.1.6. And any validation software then validate against that profile. And since the profile itself references data package, it would also validate against data package. For the table schemas, initially we included those verbosely in the data package JSON. So just copy pasting all the definitions and all the requirements for the fields. And that allows us to omit or reorder fields. So for some fields that are not occurring in your data and that are not required by Camtrap DP, you can just not include those in your CSV file and then also not include them in the table schema. The biggest problem with including the table schema verbosely, though, is that you're not validating against Camtrap DP. You're validating it against what a publisher has copied from Camtrap DP. So we didn't really think that's to be a good approach, because you're basically validating against what the publisher says is there rather than against the standards. So we've now recommended to the schema property for every resource must link out to the Camtrap DP table schemas, so all three of them. The disadvantage is that now requires all fields to be included in the CSV. There are options in Frictionless Spy to do that, but they're not included by default. And we want to be able to have Camtrap DP datasets be validated using all the default settings. Another disadvantage is that as a publisher, you need to reference 4 schemas, the 4 orange links that you can see, which it would be better if you could just reference one thing. So that could be an improvement for using Frictionless Standards, or how we can link to schemas that are developed by a community. We already have one data set in the Camtrap DP format that is published on Zenodo, and the data package JSON is not zipped with the rest of the data. So the CSV files and the JSON are all accessible individually. And that has the big advantage that you can actually load the data package JSON and see all the metadata and all the resources without downloading all the data. And this can especially be very useful for the multimedia CSV, which can be very, very, very big. So that allows you to explore a data set and only, for example, look at the observations without loading the media files. And as I've mentioned, this data set references Camtrap DP rather than including it verbosely. So you can very clearly see what version of the standard was used to publish this data set. The development. So Camtrap DP development is open and versioned on GitHub. The URL is in the bottom left corner. And the repository hosts versions of the Camtrap DP profile and the 3 table schemas, and also includes an example data set that is valid according to that version of the schema, which we use to also for automated testing. So if we make changes to the schema, that we are making sure that the example is updated with the schema as well. It's also collaborative, so the community interacts through issues, as is typical for a GitHub repository, and any change made to the standards requires a pull request review. So no changes can be made to the main branch without somebody having checked that actually makes sense as a change to the standard. There's also a website which hosts the Camtrap DP profile and the table schemas as human readable documentation. And this is all generated automatically from the source files. So we are using GitHub Pages and a Jekyll team called Petri Dish. And then we have 2 specific layouts who are basically taking the JSON files and translating it into human readable documentation. That is a nice feature that Jekyll has that allows to transform data into human readable documentation. And I like this feature actually so much that I have started reusing it for other websites where I'm using frictionless schemas and I want to express it as human readable documentation. So this is one for seabird at sea data, where again, I have a table with every field, a definition, I'm listing the controlled vocabulary and listing the type so that humans publishing this data can actually read this documentation. And it's automatically updated with every version of the standard. The software, I'm using Frictionless Spy, but mainly to just validate data sets that I'm publishing. So that is a very easy way to just make sure that a data set that I'm, for example, publishing on Zenodo is according to the specifications in Camtrap DP. In the biodiversity science, however, Python is getting used more and more, but R is typically the software language that is used for biodiversity science. And there isn't a data package R package hosted by Frictionless, but I had a little bit of issues using that one. It's very object-oriented, which is typically not what R packages are. So I've developed or started an R package that plays nice with the tidyverse, which is a framework in R with a whole bunch of packages that work in a similar way. And it currently only has 2 functionality or 2 functions. There's read package, where you can load a data package JSON file, as you can see in the example. I also made sure that if you load that from Zenodo, for example, that it's also going to reference or warn the user to credit this data source when they're using it. And then you can ask for the resource names. So in this one, it's deployments, multimedia, and observations. And then there's the second function called read resource, which is reading the CSV file or multiple CSV files or zipped CSV files into one singular data frame, and that can then immediately be used for analysis. And this is something that our researchers who use Camtrap information are already using to load Camtrap DP data for doing analysis on wildlife. Write functionality is not there. That is something we need to develop. But we so far have not found a use for it. It's more supporting users to actually read the data they have published into R. The next steps for Camtrap DP are, well, Frictionless Standards. I'm using it more and more for biodiversity data. So our team is also working on GPS tracking data for birds. And I've recently published a number of data sets that are now all expressed as data packages. And the big advantage is that those data sets were already published as a number of CSV files. But by adding the data package JSON, I can basically have a technical description of how those CSV files are related. It also allows me to use the data package R package to immediately load all that data or read all that data into an R environment. The same is done for acoustic telemetry data for fish. And I'm working to also set up community standards around frictionless data for biological signals and weather radar data. So weather radar data can also, or weather radars can detect birds, and that data is currently expressed in a horrible format. And yeah, I want to convince that community to also use data packages. So if you look on Zenodo and use the keyword frictionless data, you can discover a number of data sets that have been published as frictionless data packages. The other thing is, well, frictionless biodiversity data currently cannot be harvested by GBIF, so that is a big disadvantage. By publishing Camtrap data, for example, in this format, you can express all the essential data, but you're not really publishing your data to GBIF. So what we need is a lossy transformation to Darwin Core. And I mean lossy as in transforming to Darwin Core, you will not be able to capture everything in Darwin Core, but that's not a problem either because the source data set with all the original information is already published. So transforming to Darwin Core is technically possible, but that transformation requires community review. So we need a community approved way of, for example, translating Camtrap DP to Darwin Core. And I think we also need software to do it so that transformation can be done almost semi-automatically. And we are working on a project for bird tracking data to transform bird tracking data expressed as frictionless data to Darwin Core. And I hope to reuse that software for camera trapping data. Other software is we want to convince the data management platforms to support Camtrap DP as an export format. So there's already 2 of the data management platforms that have developed functionality to do so. And the other thing I want to do is expand data package, R package. So data sets that have, because publishing biodiversity data in Frictionless Standards, it's not going to have a huge uptake if people cannot consume those data sets that have been published either. And then for the other thing, when developing this schema, we've discovered a number of things where I think the Frictionless specs could be improved, and we want to collaborate on that. One of them is allow data sets to omit fields that are not required. So support the schema sync by default, so that you can have a CSV file that does not use all the fields expressed in the community schema. Also, it's sometimes a bit difficult to know how we can extend data package, how we can add more requirements for existing properties. We're running into a couple of issues there. It would be nice that that is documented better. And it would be very nice if rather than having those 4 URLs, publishers can just reference a single endpoint for a standard. Some of these things, and maybe people in the call might already have ideas on how to solve that, and I'm very happy to hear that. So in summary, Camtrap DP captures the essential data and metadata of a Camtrap study. It's a data exchange model and a format. For the format, we opted for Frictionless Standards, data package, which we have extended, data resource, which are the CSV files, and table schemas, for which we have defined 3. It's open versioned and collaborative, and we've, in working with this, have some feedback for the Frictionless Standards. And I think Frictionless Standards are absolutely fantastic, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel there, but to support Camtrap or community schemas. A lot is already there, but there's some minor nitpicks that could be improved. Thank you.